All right then, my name is Jacques Berlinerblau, and on behalf of the Posen Foundation and YIVO, I want to welcome each and every one of you to Was Irving Howe Right? The Rising and Falling, in parentheses, Fortunes of Jewish Secularism. Before we get started, I want to introduce you to our three distinguished panelists, and here we go. The very first, to my immediate right, is Alana New House. Alana New House is the editor-in-chief of Tablet magazine. That would be the magazine that everybody talks about. It's that one. If you're wondering which one it is, that's the one that it is, which she established in 2009. She's a graduate of Barnard College and of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Ms. Newhouse has worked as an editor for The Forward and Next Book prior to launching Tablet. She has also contributed pieces to the New York Times, among other media outlets, and is editor of the volume A Living Lens, Photographs of Jewish Life from the Pages of The Forward. To her immediate right is Mr. Samuel G. Freedman. Samuel G. Freedman is professor at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He is the author of 6 nonfiction books, including the one we're going to discuss a lot today, the 2000 Jew versus Jew, The Struggle for the Soul of American Jewry, which received the National Jewish Book Award, and The Inheritance, which was also a finalist for the 1997 Pulitzer Prize. Professor Friedman's most recent book is Who She Was, My Search for My Mother's Life. He also currently writes for the New York Times on Religion column. And then we have a pinch hitter, and we're very, very happy that he came. Professor Sarna got snowed in up in Boston, and we feel honored and relieved to have J.J. Goldberg, editor-at-large for the Jewish Daily Forward, who is filling in. Among his books are Jewish Power, Inside the American Jewish Establishment, also The Jewish Americans. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and Salon. All right, let's get going. As a scholar of secularism, I think things might get heated, and it's all good. As Mickey Sabbath in Sabbath Theater by Philip Roth points out, screaming is how a Jew thinks. So let's see if this happens here. I want to begin by asking each of our panelists, and I hope we get into more of a rapid-fire groove in our discussion, where we're going back and forth and really speaking with one another. This is how we achieve epiphany. I want to ask each one of our panelists for about 2 to 3 minutes to just free associate and tell us what they think secular Judaism is. And I do this on the basis of experience to forestall misunderstandings, because the term is so multivalent. So let's begin with Ms. Newhouse. What is secular Judaism?
I have no idea.
You got it.
I know what it might have at one point been used, the phrase might have been used to describe, but in my experience, and the experience, I think, of contemporary Jewish life, many people use the term secular Judaism to describe not being religious, which I think is actually quite different than it was used in previous generations and makes absolutely no sense. And the story I would tell is when we published the book of photography from The Forward, I went around the country and spoke to a bunch of different communities about the book and about The Forward's legacy and its future, and it was a great experience. But one of the weird things that happened at nearly every stop is in the question and answer period. First of all, I should just let you know that this is the way that Jews do Q&A. I don't have a question, I have a comment. So if you hear yourself saying that, so these people would get up and they would preface their questions to me by saying, you know, I'm not a good Jew, or I'm not really actually like an active Jew. And after the 4th or 5th time that this happened, I finally looked at the person and I said, I'm so sorry, you have to forgive me, but what the hell does that mean? And she said, well, you know, I don't keep kosher, and I don't, we don't have Shabbat or anything like that. And so I said, so what do you do? And she said, oh, well, I run the local Jewish theater. And I thought to myself, there's something incredibly wrong with this community, that people have started to define themselves by what they're not. And to them, secular Judaism is not an active badge of some sort of positive identity that they actively sought out, but it is the absence of something, which is the absence of religious practice or knowledge, more importantly. And in that way, and I think that that's actually a very poor definition for it, but I think it may be the definition that is lived in real life for most people.
It's a great point, an absence. Mr. Freedman.
Okay, thank you. So you're, like me, the jazz fans, you got us here trading 4s or maybe it's 8s to start off, so I'll take my 8. A simple definition of it would be that secular Judaism or secular Jewish identity is a form of Jewish identity that by choice doesn't utilize religious practice and observance as the basis or even a basis or even any basis for affirming one's Jewishness. The dilemma, and I think this goes to our Irving Howe question, is in the past in American Jewish history, those who enacted that kind of Jewish identity were rejecting what they knew. They were rejecting religious practice they're familiar with, and I think increasingly in the times since then, it's a rejection or just a gladly accepted ignorance of what they don't know. And that's, I think, one of the huge dividing lines. And the other thing that goes with it, and this is very much part of what Alana just said, is a sequestering on the part of self-defined secular Jews of anything that comes out of theology or religious text as being purely for religious practice, study, observance, and not part of the intellectual patrimony of the Jewish people. And I think the thing I came upon in my own work that most piercingly said that about the post-war generation was reading a book to review it a number of years ago about Jewish women in the civil rights movement. I think it was called Going South. And it was a very, very good book, but one of the things that came through in it is that these Jewish women and Jewish men who'd gone down to Mississippi for Freedom Summer and could talk in a general sense about civil rights being sort of a Jewish thing to do, had to learn about the social justice prophets from the black Christians. They didn't know about Amos, they didn't know about Hosea, they didn't know about, Isaiah and on and on and on. And that's because of this chosen willful divide that partitions off things that are part of our intellectual lives, not just our religious lives, and thinks if you dip into them at all, you're being religious, and that being secular means choosing to have no knowledge of and no interest in those. And by the way, this isn't just an American Jewish issue. I'm reminded of what Anita Shapiro, who's now written this wonderful new history of Israel that some of us are reading, has tried to do in Israel, which is create the idea for Lo Dati Israeli Jews of what she calls I can't remember if it's the Jewish bookshelf or the Zionist bookshelf, but the idea that every Jewish household, no matter how much it observes or doesn't, should have read certain texts or have access to them, again, as part of our history, as part of our intellectual heritage.
Mr. Goldberg?
I'm going to tell a story, too. I heard this from my friend Erwin Kula. He, a rabbi, he runs something called Klal. He says he was on vacation in, I think, Martha's Vineyard, and was eating in luncheonette, vegetarian, and chatting with some friends and family, and a guy leans over from the next booth and says, I couldn't help overhearing, you guys are Jewish, you're a rabbi. He said, yes. He says, well, I'm sort of Jewish also. And Erwin says, He says, well, I don't do anything Jewish. I mean, I used to be kind of Jewish, but I don't really do anything anymore. Erwin said, oh, what do you do? He said, I'm a doctor. He said, what's your specialty? He said, fertility. He said, so let me get this straight. You create life, but you don't do anything Jewish? He said the guy teared up. I agree that we have narrowed our definitions. I don't think most Jews do that consciously. I think the lack of, to the extent that people are unaware of the social message in the prophets Amos and Micah and so on, Micah and Amos, it's because they don't get much of a Jewish education at all. Let me offer 3 definitions of Jewish secularism. The most widespread and commonly used, In fact, if you say to most people, are you a secular Jew, what they will mean is, are you a disengaged, uninterested Jew? A religious Jew, and most secular activity actually, to my mind, means activity that is not engaged in for the sake of heaven, in order to fulfill a religious obligation or yearning. I study Talmud. I don't necessarily do it in order to fulfill a commandment or to understand more of what God wants of me. That's part of it, frankly. But in the same way that I think a literate American or British person should be familiar with the King James Bible and Shakespeare, as Sam was saying, part of your literary heritage. So to my mind, that's a secular activity. The third definition, now, well, I'll get back to that second definition because I think it's the most important. The third definition is the one that was adopted in the late 1800s and is the one that Irving Howe took for granted and is the one that is, I believe, disappearing, which is the conscious attempt to create a non-religious Jewish culture in Yiddish, basically, in the language that Jews spoke when they were trying to do this. Jews mainly don't speak Yiddish anymore, except, ironically, for the very, very religious ones. So that culture cannot particularly exist as a form of interest. I'll give you two examples. I keep on hearing that Yiddishism, labor Zionism, that whole experience is gone. Well, my kids go to labor Zionist camp. They're active in the movement. There are 7 of them. There are about 1/4 as many beds at labor Zionist summer camps in this country as there are at conservative Ramah camps in this country. The big difference is the Ramah camps have a budget of several million from the conservative movement. The labor Zionists used to be dependent on the Israeli Labor Party and the Histadrut, and now the budget is 0. The camp in New York went bust in the 80s, and the kids started it again. That's the one my kids go to. And they rounded up some parents to raise some money to rent a site. So there is, now what is the difference between the Yiddishist experience, which had, I guess, 250,000 self-identified, active, engaged, and affiliated people in the 1920s, and probably 20,000 in the 1950s and 60s, and a few hundred today, and the labor Zionist experience in this country, which had, I don't know, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 in the 1930s, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 in the 1960s, and probably 3,000, maybe 2,000 today. It's steady, small but steady. It is connection with an older experience. My friends growing up in the labor Zionist movement, we studied Torah and Talmud. Our parents believed that if you're going to reject something, know what you're rejecting. We didn't rely on Ayel Peretz and Shalom Aleichem as the definition of Jewish culture. It's not sticky. And by the way, I don't think that Ayel Peretz and Shalom Aleichem wrote in order to create a secular Jewish culture. They wrote because they had something to say. So finally, I believe the Jewish culture now consists of what Jews do. That is identifiable and distinct. I think one of the best examples, one of the best purveyors of Jewish culture today is Jon Stewart. He talks about it all the time. On every Jewish holiday, he does a riff about the Jewish holiday, what it means to him, his difficulties with it. I don't know if you saw his Pesach thing last spring. He goes on for like 10 minutes. Guys, let's step our game up. We, mishpacha, he always says. They got chocolate eggs, chocolate bunnies, baskets full of candy. We have horseradish.
Okay, so the third definition, just to reiterate, could you just give us that third definition very, very quickly?
Third definition,
right.
One definition is Jews who are not very engaged. One definition, and I don't think that's very useful, although that's the one that people hear, and we need to struggle with that if we want to define secular Judaism. It's not a useful term. One definition is trying to create an artifice that is based on deliberately non-religious, it's eating ham sandwiches in front of the shul on Yom Kippur, to make a point. And the third definition is the culture of Jews, which, as most Jews practice it, including most who go to shul, is not for the sake of heaven, but simply because they are Jewish and it's what they do. It's well, I'll get into how sticky I think it is. I think that's the future of Jewish life. Okay. Most Jews, I think, are that kind of Jew, and I think most half-Jews are that kind of Jew and want to be.
Okay, a couple of more objects to set on our table before we get to Mr. Howe's work. Rabbis, I'm just going to put this out there, rabbis are whispering in my ear that they don't hear secular Jew anymore, they hear cultural Jew. Maybe we'll come back to that. Or that's what people are coming to the rabbis, especially in Reform and conservative movements. Second, secular Judaism, some other possible definitions. Secular Judaism as non-belief, while maintaining a very strong Jewish identity. Secular Judaism as religious moderation, ergo not all 613 commandments. Another possibility, which nobody has mentioned, though I sense we have many people that were there for this, the great wave of separationist Jews at mid-century who called themselves secular Jews because of their commitment to separation of church and state. And with that said, let's get to Irving Howe. I'm going to ask each one of our distinguished panelists to do a little exegesis. We are witnessing, writes Irving Howe, the end of a major phase of Jewish history, the phase of Yiddishkeit, with which is interwoven the rise and fall of Jewish secularism. Here is Howe's definition, I think, of Jewish secularism, a whole segment of Yiddish-speaking Jews who abandon religion yet remain utterly Jewish. And with that said, we're going to play the exegesis game. So I'm going to read a passage to you, Mr. Freedman, if you would kindly tell us what you think, what you're hearing, and what you're not hearing, other than that cell phone. What occurred in Jewish life, this is from the 1995 article published by Hunter University about secular Judaism, which was published posthumously by Irving Howe. What occurred in Jewish life these past 2 centuries, wonderfully rich and chaotic, was the rise of a secular Jewish culture, though one with strong religious elements. Among the reasons it is hard to discuss Jewish history in terms of Western historiography is that the secular and religious, if clearly distinguishable as categories, are, in the Jewish experience, hopelessly interwoven.
I agree with him very much about the interweaving. I think part of what we're seeing is the unraveling of that interweaving. When you're talking about some of the different definitions of cultural Judaism, I don't think observing less than 613 means being a secular Jew, and I think that it's revealing the person who goes to the rabbi and says, I'm a cultural Jew. The fact that they go to a rabbi suggests that they have some attachment to congregational life. And there's been a flourishing, an incredible explosion of Jewish cultural life in this country. In some ways, it has never been better if you think of theater, film festivals, journalism, etc. Now, I'm not going to ask JJ or Alana to let any of their audience demographics out for public, but I've wondered, for instance, as someone who just admires tremendously the foreword and Tablet has written for both of them, what percentage of their audience has a congregational membership? I'll bet quite a lot. And I think that that's revealing of the person who goes to the rabbi and says, I'm a cultural Jew. They may feel that they're not fully observant, but they still feel necessity to be attached to religious ritual in a certain way. And I think, JJ, I hope we'll come back to this, it's that idea of stickiness, of what's going to have more traction over the long run. And so I think in that respect, Howe's correct. The difference, I would say, is he saw it purely tied to Yiddish, but I think there's also a generation that was a transitional generation coming out of Yiddish and into English, but that was very much part of that world. Now, it's not that we don't have those expressions anymore, but just look at literature, which is a field I know a little bit, and think about what to me are the 2 most interesting boomlets within modern American Jewish literature. One of them is the literature that comes out of and is inspired by or is done in reaction to religious life. So whether it's not, a gleeful epichorus like Shoam Oslander, or whether it's Tova Mirvis, or whether it's Jonathan Rosen, or whether it's Allegra Goodman, a lot of the terrific fiction being written and nonfiction is coming out of people who are writing about and reacting to Jewish religious life. That would have been unforeseen. And the other boomlet is the more recent immigration stream of Russian Jews. So you have, Gary Steingart and David Bezmoigas and so on. I won't try to slaughter the names. I barely command one language, plus a little Siddur Hebrew, so I won't try Russian. But I think that both confirms and to a certain extent challenges Howe's words. It confirms it because neither of those forms fit the model that he sketched out, that I agree has fissioned, but they challenge him in the sense that it means that Jewish culture keeps adapting and changing, and because what he was talking about hasn't had legs or hasn't had really strong legs, doesn't mean that a whole part of Jewish artistic expression is falling by the wayside.
Okay, thank you. Part 2, Howe hermeneutics, and JJ, this one's for you. I'm going to read it very slowly. The East European Jewish culture can start everything but finish nothing. Its conflicting tendencies must remain close to one another, the faithful with the atheists, the Zionists near the socialists, the Hebraists abutting the Yiddishists, because all are locked into the common Jewish fate. As upon migration to America, they will be locked for a generation or two into the urban ghettos. With what results? A feverish brilliance, an intense moral idealism, a hyper-intellectuality, a people, as Mendele says, with its head in the clouds and its body in a barrel. And then the ghetto falls apart, the shtetl deshtetalizes. JJ, what do you think about it?
It didn't happen. He was wrong. Around the time, I think he was one of the people who wrote, I'm not an expert in literature. Mostly I read nonfiction. Science fiction, action movies, that the Bernard Malamud, Saul Bellow, and Philip Roth would be the last generation of American Jewish literature. And right around the time that he was writing that, Ted Solitaroff and Nessa Rappaport came out with an anthology, Writing Our Way Back Home, of the new generation, and there's been another generation since that of 20-somethings and 30-somethings who are creating literature that can be called, it's about the experience of being Jewish. So it didn't happen, this disappearance. The ghetto walls fell. I believe one of the reasons that it's not happening is, first of all, Irving Howe, not Irving Howe, Saul Bellow and Philip Roth, and Woody Allen and Shecky Green created an acceptance in America where creating Jewish art is part of the American experience. Most people who create Jewish art these days aren't trying to create Jewish art, and frequently they resent being called Jewish artists. They're creating art out of their own experience and what they observe and what they think is important, and it's about being Jewish because they are. And America eats it up. And it continues. It will continue as long as being Jewish in America is high status. Henry Kissinger, and Saul Bellow, and Woody Allen, and Bob Dylan broke down certain barriers for us so that being Jewish is high culture. And I would say David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel. Being Jewish is cool in America. My experience is, well, actually, I could give you statistics. If you ask people with one Jewish parent, half Jews, what is your religion? 28%, and this is over and over again, and it's a weird number, but it always comes out to 28%, say Jewish. But if you ask them, for example, there was a study of adult children of intermarriage, 28%. Then they ask them, what is the thing that you most appreciate about being Jewish? And I think it was 75 or 80% had an answer. Meaning, for me, being Jewish means, obviously it's not religion, but they regard themselves. You look at the celebrities, Scarlett Johansson, Ryan Braun, Michael Douglas, they all regard themselves aggressively as Jewish. And they make themselves, to some extent, role models of Judaism. Not practice, although Gwyneth Paltrow has a food blog, very well known, less well known. Every spring she does her favorite kosher Pesach recipes for the Seder. And this is widespread. There's a lot of this. People who are growing up with one Jewish parent or one Jewish grandparent at a certain point, or a parent who participate to the extent that they feel like it. And finally, the word utterly. I think that's the key word that Howe gets wrong. There was a time when you were utterly Jewish because you lived here and you didn't live here. We now have a concept that didn't exist 100 years ago or 200 years ago that is coming to be in Israel, but most Israelis don't understand it, which is more Jewish and less Jewish. You're not either Jewish or not Jewish. You could be. Last year I was more Jewish. I'm thinking of being more Jewish next year. I'm getting less Jewish lately. Meaning the things that I do are self-consciously or actively Jewish or speak to me on a Jewish level. How often do I do them? Every week, every month, a few times a year, every waking minute, every time I read the paper. So I think as long as Jewish remains high status, people will identify with that half of themselves as often as it's comfortable.
All right, and quote number 3 in Howe Hermeneutics. Alana, I selected this one specifically for you. This is a plangent observation on his part. The sad truth, to me endlessly sad, is that this culture is reaching its end. My Yiddishist friends become upset when I say this, but we are concerned here with truth, not consolation. Seen in retrospect, the culture of Yiddish was a victim of the whole of modern history, both the murderous rage of the totalitarian states and the subtle enticements of the liberal democracies. It now begins to seem as if we can mark out roughly a phase of Jewish history, say the past 200 years, in which both the culture of Yiddish and secular Jewishness flourished and then declined. Plangent.
What am I going to say? He was a brilliant crank. He was brilliant, and he was brilliant. He was a brilliant literary critic in some ways, but he was always looking for opportunities to bray about something that was about to die. There's something incredibly mournful. I find it, I'm kindred with that impulse, but I don't know that he was right. And he liked mourning for things way before they were even in the hospital.
Many older Jewish men of that generation anathematized
right.
at the ends of their lives.
That's right. And so the question, obviously, for me, I'm a student of psychoanalysis, but the thing that I find most interesting is to put Howe on the couch and actually ask why he was so obsessed with things dying. But, you know, I guess it kind of brings me to a question for you, if I may ask one, which is, why are we here? Meaning, why... The real way to answer what is secular Judaism is to first answer who's asking and why do they want to know. Because if what you're saying to me is that everybody in this room, we are all Jewish professionals and we are now going to create policy and programs and give money as a result of whatever definition we all decide to agree on, then this conversation needs to go in one direction. If we are actually trying to conceive of how to think about Jewish history from a purely intellectual exercise, then I think it should go in a different direction. But I think that as one of the things that we're all trying to get at is, many people define themselves in ways that we would not define them. So, and I think that secular Judaism is a good example. In the most recent past in American Jewish life, the word unaffiliated is the other one, which has no meaning at all, and actually is a word that everyone bandies about and uses very, with a lot of gravitas, and it has no meaning. To American Jews, it has absolutely no effect on their lives, and it's not the way they would necessarily understand themselves. But this is a definition that we've put on people. And now they're coming to think that they should inhabit it, but of course they don't. So the one brief answer to one of your questions, Tablet did, in one of our first surveys, And I'm going to give this one because the numbers are so stark. In one of our first surveys, which I think Tablet was 5 or 6 months old, we asked people how they would identify themselves. And something like 93% said as they unaffiliated in the choices, right? Except nearly every single one of them either sent their kids to Jewish camp, to Jewish school, were members of a synagogue. That is not unaffiliated. And I didn't know how to explain. I mean, how do you look at somebody and say, you're not unaffiliated, you're affiliated up the wazoo? But that they didn't want to define themselves as Orthodox. They didn't want to define themselves as conservative or Reformed. They wanted to define themselves as unaffiliated, even though they weren't. So I guess one of the ways in which, as we start to open up this conversation, my question to you is how are we supposed to be thinking about how to answer this?
Okay, very quickly, you mentioned, let me go back to something prior. You mentioned putting Howe on the couch. I think Philip Roth did that in the anatomy lesson, by the way, right? Which was a literary revenge killing for Howe's takedown, right? I think the takedown of Roth in terms of secular America is actually very, very interesting. We'll get into it as we go forward. I want to hear more from you on this. I would just say in response to your issue, the Kaiser-Kosman study of 2008, the Aegis, right, found that 27% of American Jews refer to themselves as secular, and 17%, the category was Jews by birth, as somewhat secular. So, Alana, if somebody comes to me and says 44% of community X assumes, embraces, has this identity, as a social scientist, I've got questions. I want to know who they are, I want to know what they're thinking about, how they inhabit, to use your excellent term, how they inhabit that category. I'm sure we'll get back to this as we go around. I want to ask you all a very, very quick question. My mother is a Sephardic Jew. It's an intermarriage. She's married to an Ashkenazi Jew, right? Really? There we go. And did your mom teach you to look at Ashkenazi Jews as gefilte fish quaffing Philistines?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. No, the Sephardim were royalty, and the Ashkenazi, it was horrible. I mean, and the gefilte fish was actually like a real point of
contention.
It was the total
It was
evocation of what was
a bitter
wrong.
issue,
Yes,
so to speak.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bitter and sweet at the same time. I'm going to ask the two gentlemen over here. It's a very interesting problematic. How links Yiddishkeit and secularism? There's some scholarship that is really looking at Sephardic culture and secularism. So my question for the two of you is, ought we really start disarticulating this idea, right, that there was this great secular Jewish moment, and it just flamed and raged mid-century, and then it died out in the 60s and the 70s, when in fact there are other places outside of that very rich Yiddish culture in which it flourished and still flourishes. Let's start with JJ.
Yeah, obviously. Howe used secular Jewish culture to mean Yiddish, to mean the flourishing high culture of late 19th century and early 20th century Eastern Europe, and the degree to which it transplanted to America. And, you know, I am sorry, the Yiddish culture of Eastern Europe was assassinated. By the way, I want to disagree with one thing he said. The dictatorships of Europe stamped it out. The Soviet dictatorship heavily subsidized Yiddish culture. They still put out Yiddish magazines. The current editor of the Yiddish Forward, Boris Sandler, is from Kish. And as a matter of fact, I injured myself. I needed physical therapy. I went to this physical therapy place in Midtown, and I had like a young 20-something guy with an earring, and he said, "What do you do?" I work for the Forward. He said, "Oh, I read the Forward at my grandmother's house." I said, "You do?" He said, "Yeah, in Yiddish." I said, "You're from Kishinev." He said, "Yeah, how'd you know?" Because Kishinev is the place where that culture survives. It is the place where it was the last place in the world to have a Yiddish daily newspaper was Birobidzhan, because it was government subsidized. And when communism fell, so did the last Yiddish daily newspaper. They still, by the way, a couple of years ago, Birobidzhan is a province way north of North Korea, on the Amur River, just across the river from the Harbin province of China. Birobidzhan is a kind of a godforsaken place. It's about 5% Jewish. Harbin is a huge industrialized, highly cultured Chinese province. And if you go to their website, the Birobidzhan, they've got an English website. It's great stuff there. The vice premier is always Jewish. It's always named Fishman or Dobkin or something like that. Everybody else is Russian, obviously.
But he's not a Sephardic Jew, right?
No, never a Sephardic Jew.
Just asking. Just,
The airport has Birobidzhan in stone above the airport in Yiddish, except that it's Stalin's Yiddish. They don't have the final letters. It's Birobidzhan with a middle nun, because he outlawed the final nun to separate himself from Hebrew and Jewish tradition, to separate Russian Jews. The first Birobidzhaner Jew elected to the Knesset is in the current Yesh Atid list. What's his name? Yoel Ravzavov, I think his name is.
and he's a Sephardic Jew.
He must be Sephardic.
But let's get to the Sephardic Jew.
The Sephardic experience, the Sephardic experience, it goes on to the extent that in Montreal it goes on, in France it goes on. It has mainly been subsumed into an Israeli experience. Ladino survived less than Yiddish did. And it's more of a memory, I think. Many people will tell you that the Sephardic experience in Israel has been somewhat degraded, and its champions are consciously aping Ashkenazi Hasidism, the Shas party. The Yiddish experience translates into something that masses of American and Israeli Jews relate to. It translates in a modern emanation. The Sephardic experience, most Jews don't really know about it.
Is it Sephardic or Mizrahi?
I'm going to say Sephardic, not Mizrahi.
Like
by the way,
Ladino
right?
Sephardic?
Like Ladino Sephardic.
Okay, so
Where are
that's
your folks
yeah.
from?
Also,
Just
like
out of
in
curiosity.
Macedonia, but so I mean, I think that we also need to define this more differently. I mean, because Mizrahi Jews have huge culture that's thriving in Brooklyn. So I think but yeah, we were kind of screwed.
All right, Mr. Freedman, disarticulating secular Judaism from Yiddishkeit, possible? Worthwhile?
I think what Howe was reflecting was the demographic reality of the United States. He was disregarding the Sephardi, and also for that matter, the Mizrahi experience, the same way he was disregarding most of the Yekka experience in this country. He was reflecting what the numbers were at that time, which was you had 2 million Jews come here from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1924, and they created the overwhelming demographic majority of Jewish population in America. And when that happens, typically you set the cultural norms, and they did. And part of it is if you produce writers and scholars and politicians, even more so, you're articulating your story, and it does tend to crowd out the others. So I think I'm not defending the lack of scholarly attention to the Sephardi secular or the Sephardi religious experience in this country. It deserves, its own scholars, and you find these places where it has flourished. Seattle, obviously, parts of the New York area. I wrote about a congregation in Indianapolis. These were mostly Jews from the Balkans who had ended up in Indianapolis. They still use Ladino in their service. And all this is wonderful stuff to write about and to do scholarship on, but I don't think there's anything nefarious about Howe's point because it reflected where the numbers were. But I do think in an interesting way, and maybe this is certainly blurring the Mizrahi Sephardi line, but allow me to do that for a moment. We were talking about gefilte fish before. Just think about this as a sign of tremendous cultural transformation in Jewish life in this country. The typical Shabbat table now always has hummus, baba ganoush, often will have pita alongside challah. Not that many Shabbat tables will regularly have gefilte fish and chopped liver and shav and the things that were normative on the table of Ashkenazi American Jewish families in the past. That sort of has happened without anyone paying attention. We talk about the demise of the deli, the exception of a few artisanal ones like Miles End in Brooklyn, but that old kind of Lower East Side deli that we grew up on, that's been slipping down the charts, but everywhere where there are Jews, you're going to find a number of Middle Eastern Jewish restaurants. You're going to find falafel, hummus, all these things proliferating. That's a gigantic cultural change. I think the nature of liturgical music is shifting. The effect that Israeli rock and roll, a lot of which is being made by Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews there, Hud Banai and Eddie Ankri and Sheva and go on and on. That, at least for Jews who are really involved in the cultural life here, communicates to American Jews. The number of Israeli jazz musicians who come here who also double on, on the oud or, have picked up chordal schemes from Arabic music, or who is it, Sarah Aroesti? Your cousin. So I have your cousin's CD. Who made a very hip album of Ladino songs. So I think that the cultural tide is swinging back in a really, really interesting way.
All right, so
Just add one more point.
Quickly though, please.
I think, to a certain extent, I agree that the Israeli influence, Boaz Sha'arabi and Gerard Edry in this country, there is a self-consciously Sephardic culture, but the Sephardim did not live sufficiently separately from their surrounding long enough to create a large culture in the way that Yiddish. A friend of mine, some friends of mine, got married. He's Ashkenazi, she's Sephardic, Syrian. They had two bands in two different rooms at the wedding. One was a klezmer band, and one was an Arab band, because there is no great difference. Hummus and falafel are Arab foods. And Jews in Eastern Europe were separate and populous long enough to create a highly distinct culture. The Jews of the Mediterranean basin were so integrated for so long that a distinct Sephardic Jewish culture, as distinguished from its surroundings, it wasn't that great, and there isn't, last word, as much of an audience or a market for it.
All right, we're going to come back to secular Judaism. We had Professor Sarna as one of our panelists. I very quickly want to bring to your attention his analysis, which I think is genius, of why this secular Jewish culture, which we're all trying to figure out, did it actually exist, the one that Howe articulated. He gave a variety of reasons for its demise. I quickly want to go through those, and then I want to look back with our panelists. All right, the first would be the demise of Yiddish as a lingua franca. The second was the end of involuntary segregation of Jews. The third was the end of secular and religious Jews living side by side. The fourth, to the person that mentioned this earlier, was the decline of anti-Semitism. The fifth was the decimation of European Judaism in the Shoah. And the sixth, very important, was the routing and delegitimizing of socialism and communism as legitimate political ideologies for a Jew to espouse, right? Whenever I speak to Jews that were around in the 50s and 60s, there's always an anti-Esti back there who made great Rugelech and was a communist. And the degree to which this has been discredited in Jewish thought is astonishing. Let's imagine that culture lived and ebbed and flamed, and let's just imagine for a second before we get to another unit that it died. What do we have to look back to it that we loved? And what do we have as we reflect back on this Jewish culture that was like, eh? So for me, Philip Roth, the tail end of the comet, that was just a wonderful thing, all right? The downside were these radical political herky-jerks that we saw this entire generation go through, from socialism at City College to full-blown neoconservatism. I think Roth is getting at this, by the way, in American Pastoral with the character of Mary Levov, who blows up a post office. I want to ask each one of you, if you think this secular Judaism existed and was in fact there, what was really a wonderful incandescent aspect of it, and what was something that we really could leave by the wayside? Let's start with JJ.
There was an exhibit, a wonderful exhibit, probably 20 years ago, at I think it was the New York Historical Society, Bridges and Boundaries, the Black Jewish Experience. And they had a whole section on Jewish communists. They made the point that the Jews who pioneered and fought as Jews for an alliance with the black community and for the rights of black people were the communists more than anybody else. It took the non-communist community a longer time to get on board with that. I think because they were duped by the Soviet Union. Jewish socialists, Jewish radicals, lost a lot of credibility for some very important messages. I think it's coming back, by the way. I think Bernie Sanders. And and a whole world, the Progressive Caucus and the Democrats, House Democrats. If you look at the revival of Yiddish culture, Tony Kushner and Elisa Solomon, and there's a whole, and they consciously reach back to that. They constantly use the word radical or progressive. They rarely use the word communist, but that's who they're talking about. The Yiddish is seen, gay people, for example, radical, left-wing, Jewish, gay people create an identity around Yiddish because it's a way of seceding from the mainstream community and identifying with that period. So I don't think it went away entirely. I think it continues to bubble, and I think it's rising.
So the social justice paradigm is really...
The social justice paradigm is actually rising faster than I think anybody expected. Okay. I think it draws a lot from that experience. If you say, what's Jewish about the social justice thing, they'll either go to the prophets or to that whole, the garment unions. And so that lives on in the memories of a lot of individual Jews and in the aspirations for self-expression of a lot of individual Jews, and a lot of Jews who are unaffiliated because they don't see anything worth joining. Okay. That doesn't express that.
Mr. Freedman, what is there to laud and what is there to damn?
Well, to laud certainly the literature, Roth, Bellow, Malamud, but also, Anzia Yazurska, Henry Roth. There are so many wonderful writers.
Joseph Heller, Mordechai Richler.
Right, you can go back to, and that body of literature is, Anne Royf, who's sort of talking about the end of the comet, Loving Kindness is as good a novel about post-war Judaism as you're going to find. Glad to give it a shout out. So I'll miss that. I will also miss the intensity of political argument that made it feel like everything mattered. I think maybe in Joe Dorman's terrific documentary, Arguing the World, which is about Nathan Glazer, Daniel Bell, Irving Kristol, and Irving Howe, and of course Norman Podhoretz sort of hovering in that same aura, although he's not in the documentary as much. One of them may have said this, but they needed each other because no one else cared as much about ideas and ideology as they did. It's like Ali and Fraser needed each other. They've brought out the combatant in the other. They brought out the respect as well as the vitriol in the other. And as someone who grew up in an arch atheist house and learned, while I was a mere wee one, a little picture about the difference between the Lovestonites and the Shackmanites. I think that tremendous passion about politics was a good thing, not a bad thing. I think JJ's point about Jewish communists and the civil rights movement is well drawn. It's something I've thought about a lot. But the thing I won't miss, specifically out of the Black Jewish paradigm, is a certain Jewish paternalism that tended to presume that Jews knew better than blacks what blacks should do, that it was up to Jews to come in and do for blacks for them, rather than to really collaborate as equals. And while SNCC bears and the Black Power movement bears its share of the blame for the blowout of the Black-Jewish alliance, I think a certain Jewish haughtiness and sense of never quite articulated superiority about it also played a role, and I won't miss that.
Excellent. Alana, before we get to the elephant in the room, it's coming, the I word, Alana, to praise, to damn. What do you think of when you think of this culture?
I have to echo Sam's choices, although I really don't know that those could be assigned to secular Judaism. I think that's that was just 20th century Jewish history that developed those things. Those are definitely things I would.
Labor activism. I mean, that's.
But you can't see these things in vacuums.
Right?
I feel like their history is a broad arc, and I just don't know what I'm assigning both the credit and debit to. And the only thing I will say is I will tell one last story, which is from the same Forward book tour, and it relates back to your opening remarks. At the end of my speech, I was signing books, and a woman came up to me and she said, so some things about the history of Yiddish newspapers. And I said, I actually don't know a ton about the history of Yiddish newspapers. We put together this book about this one Yiddish newspaper. And she said, well, my father read something called the Freiheit. Had you ever heard of that? And I'm busy signing books, and I was like, oh yeah, your father was a communist. And my father was a what? And I froze, and I said, oh, I don't know your father. I just want to the Freiheit was a communist newspaper. That's the only thing. She goes, Herman, and she calls over her husband, and she goes, this girl here is saying that my father was a communist. And Herman takes one look at me, and he goes, I never liked him.
All right, now to the elephant in the room. We've got to deal with it. Egon Mayer of blessed memory, the demographer, once said, trying to stop intermarriage is like trying to stop the wind. Reform synagogues, in my experience, come in two flavors. Guitar strumming yippee-dippy or power havens. I personally belong to a power haven in Washington, D.C. I previously belonged to a yippee-dippy one. When they would read off names, whenever they would read off names, this is what the roll call sounded like. Are you ready? Schlabatnik, Cohen, McGinty, Rodriguez, Woo. And I thought it was a beautiful thing. But I'm going to ask our panelists here. There are those of us, I would cite the research of Calvin Goldscheider, a scholar that does not get enough play, I think. There are those of us here who, through our life, our lived experience, are committed to the idea that intermarriage is not the shanda that folks were claiming it was after the infamous 1992, I believe it was the Aris study. I want everyone to be really, really candid here, all right? Just let loose, all right? I don't think I need to tell you to let loose. Really tell us what you think. I'm going to come out right here for purposes of dialectical conversation as a father of intermarried children that are in a synagogue that sees a lot of possibility. And I'm going to ask you to say whatever you feel you need to say about the issue. Let's start with Sam, Alana, and then JJ. Here we go.
Well, I think you can't inveigh against interfaith marriage. You can't have the kind of literal and metaphorical love for Jews that America has without having individuals fall in love as couples. So I think the era of trying to beat your fists against the wall about it or denounce it or say it's the silent Holocaust, that hopefully is over. It's ridiculous. On the other hand, I think while there are always exceptions that you can find, I have no doubt that it overall plays a corrosive effect on Jewish identity and Jewish continuity. But the other thing that goes with it is that we're also in an era, even in my own life, about a few weeks away from marrying a Jew by choice, but an era of volitional Judaism rather than Judaism by bloodline, and that's an exciting thing. And that Rodriguez, in your story, it might be the non-Jewish partner in an intermarried couple, or it also could be a Rodriguez who converted. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing a huge amount of that that's really, I think, enriching the Jewish experience, because these are people who are choosing to be there and bringing a genuine kind of diversity to being Jewish, not diversity meaning we have Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox under the same roof.
Mr. Freedman, you've been very, very good on this issue. You've written a lot. I don't agree, but you said corrosive. Can you just tell us very quickly before we get to JJ, why corrosive for Judaism writ large, the body of Judaism?
Well, I don't have the exact numbers of the studies I looked at hand, but if I can remember in a broad sense of what I was looking at for my book and what I've looked at many times since then, many of the measures of Jewish involvement, whether it's, congregational membership, whether it's engagement in some way with Israel, whether it's, going to the Jewish Film Festival, whether your kids go to Jewish camp or day school, all of those things tend to be at their lowest ebb for interfaith couples. And also because I think while JJ's right, being Jewish is cool, but the civil culture of America remains a Christian culture. It may not be actively Christian, it's more passively Christian, but most children out of intermarriage, and then the next generation might be a quarter Jewish, 2 more generations might be an eighth Jewish, are going to have to make a very intense thought through deliberate choice to identify and to enact as Jews, because the air around them, again, the overall culture in a passive kind of way is a Christian culture, or certainly not a Jewish culture.
Excellent. JJ.
I'm an agnostic on this. I've written a lot. I sort of became identified at a certain point. It happened after the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, which 52%, more than half the Jews are intermarrying. There was a hearing about this in the Knesset, and the Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress testified and said half of the Jews in America assimilate every year. I don't know what that means. The disappearing American Jew. And I wrote a column once about a friend of the family. He was an uncle who actually disappeared once. They found his car on the Grand Central Parkway. There was blood. Never seen again. And he's the only Jew I know who has disappeared. Everybody else is right there. And you can talk to them. And they make choices, yes. I recently reconnected with an old friend named Cohen, his daughter Sarah Cohen. They have a Seder every year. They fast on Yom Kippur. They do a lot of Jewish things. She went to college. She joined Hillel. They found out her mother wasn't Jewish and essentially froze her out. And she's like, oh, I can't do this anymore. I can't fight. To the extent that I went to my old temple. I was bar mitzvahed in a Reform temple on Long Island. Then I went to an Orthodox Hebrew high school. It's been a journey. Driving past Massapequa once, I said, I'm going to get off the road and go visit my old temple. And I walked in, and the first person I met was the head of the preschool. What percentage? Oh, I remember why the sign out front said, this weekend's bar mitzvah, Sean Donahue. I actually got the phone number of the mother. She said, yeah, my older son is Troy. I swear. You date yourself by laughing or not. So this woman opens her card box. This is before, I guess, I'm dating myself now, before databases. She said, here's a Riggio, a DeFeo, a Donahue, a McCloskey. Here's a Goldstein. The father must be Jewish. More than half the kids in many Reform Jewish Sunday schools are not Jewish.
Right.
That's a statistic. And one of the impacts is that the movement, the Union for Reform, the office in Manhattan, sends out curricula and syllabuses, and one of the things you're supposed to do is teach kids Jews marry Jews. And the teachers can't do that because they're telling half the kids in their class you shouldn't have been born. So it has quietly been dropped from the agenda, and it's happening. So people don't even learn that they're not supposed to marry non-Jews because they can't, and they find out to their shock. Now, the biggest difference between the half-Jew and the one Jewish parent and two Jewish parents is half of your family celebrates Christmas and is Christian, and you don't have any sense of being them. The otherness of the Jewish experience is not part of the experience of the half-Jew. They don't know about it. They don't feel it. It's not in their bones. So that intermarriage is, I don't know if it's corroding. We won't know for 100 or 200 years whether a new American Judaism will evolve or whether it'll disappear. Are we at a moment like Yochanan ben Zakkai where Judaism is redefined and becomes something entirely different? Or are we at a moment like Kaifeng in China where Judaism just dissolves in the surrounding because it's accepted?
And we should all see as a proof text Sam Freedman's The Final Chapter of Jew versus Jew. I want to get to Alana. I want to put a literary text in your mind, Allegra Goodman's Paradise Park. Just think about it, those of you that know it, with the issue at the end. Alana, have at it. The intermarriage question and secular Judaism.
I think that for me personally, as in terms of my professional life, I'm not a rabbi. I don't run the UJA. I'm an editor. I run a journalistic outlet, and that journalistic outlet serves readers. And many of those readers are the products of intermarriage, or they are they are in a couple that is intermarried. And it is I see it as my job to speak to them and to understand and reflect back at them what their experiences are, sometimes to challenge them, but we try to challenge all of our readers in all of the different ways in which they purport to have a Jewish identity that we think needs to be challenged. And so we live with this reality. And I don't know that inveighing against it, I think that what we do need to accept is that whatever the Jewish community did for many decades was the wrong thing to do. That's from a psychological and emotional perspective, the messaging that we sent to people, which was, being Jewish is not necessarily so much fun, and it isn't so great, but you have to do it. That is a surefire way to make people run for the hills. And the fact that we now look at people and we say, couples actually look at their children and they say, no, I know I didn't give you a Jewish education. No, I know I also hated making Seder. No, I know I hated shul, but you need to marry a Jew. Why? I mean, it's so, and we don't even parse the psychologically complicated and corrupted messaging that we're sending our kids.
And also, let me show you these Holocaust films with cadavers aplenty. Gary Steingart and I have had this discussion, the effect of those videos on young Jewish children.
Don't you want to be part of that?
But I actually think, I'm a lone person, I think, that who actually thinks that the Holocaust I think it actually, weirdly, is not thought of correctly. I don't know that it's that big a deal. I think that children understand that there's tragedy and there are horrible things that happen. I think the bigger issue is seeing their parents bored to death and playing with their iPhones in shul, the 2 times a year that they go. The fact that they're looking at adults finding absolutely no richness in this tradition. Tragedy is tragedy. It happens to all of us. And it's something that actually I think kids have much more malleable minds and they can accept certain things. I mean, not that anybody should accept the Holocaust, but they can process it. What they can't process is somebody telling them that they should be part of something that all the adults around them seem to have no interest in. That makes no sense to me.
All right, to use a jazz metaphor, we are locked into our groove. It took a while, but the quartet got there. 1 minute from each of you, then we'll take some quick questions and we'll go lunching. Channel your inner Irving Howe. Give us a prognosis. Don't be scared. Don't mince words. What is the future of secular Judaism in the United States? In 1 minute, please.
There's another I word that we haven't touched on, which is Israel. As long as Judaism remains high culture and fashionable, I think a majority of children of intermarriage will continue to identify, and the experience of the Jews in America combined, more liberal than everybody else, in many ways more literate and more culturally affiliated. Jews have a distinct experience in America, and that will be Jewish culture. It'll have a bit of traditional literature and religion. I'd like to see it have more, but it'll be that. To the extent that Israel and its behavior make Judaism an unpleasant identity, where you hear yourself trashed in the media or it's uncomfortable on campus, we will find a generation growing up that doesn't want to be part of it. So I think secular Judaism, in the sense of the experience, the combined experience of Jews and what they create, Bob Dylan's songs about Father of Night, Jews who sit out the Yom Kippur on the Boston Red Sox, all of these things, the books, the Gary Steingarts, that will continue to grow and continue to have a market as long as it remains fashionable. And that's the great danger.
Okay, Mr. Freedman.
I think certainly it doesn't go away, but I would think of it in terms of concentric circles. I think the hot center of what's this very vibrant moment in American Jewish life is going to be made by people who both have cultural Jewish identities but have a degree of religious knowledge and or practice. That's kind of the red hot center. The next ring around it will be those who strongly identify as Jewish and don't have or don't want any part of religion, not only as a belief system, but even as an intellectual system. And then the next ring around that will be those who are more distant, but will sort of dip in and dip out if there's something fun to go to. You know, if you can go hear, you know, an interesting show at City Winery, then they'll go and do it. Or if there's an interesting if Footnote got good reviews, you'll go up and see the movie. So it won't be any kind of renunciation, but it'll be, episodic, thank you. And also very true, we've talked entirely in the language of Jewish exceptionalism today. We have to also think about what our experience shares with other immigrant groups who've come to this country and what has happened, although it's not identical, but to Irish, to Italians, to Latinos, now that we're finding in an era where binary race is breaking down, what it means to African Americans. So these, Asian Americans, Korean Americans, these debates we're having are not, as we might think, entirely our own by any means.
Wonderful. We started about 9 to 10 minutes late, so I'm just going to assume we can go 9 or 10 minutes of questions after Ms. Newhouse's final remark. You get the last word.
Like Irving Howe, I am a terrible futurist, but unlike Irving Howe, I am actually going to restrain myself from doing it. I have no idea what's going to happen.
And with that said, questions, please, not manifestos, as many as we can get in. That gentleman has wanted to say something basically, even before we began. Yes, sir.
Jonathan Brent, if he's here, he put it best, an event earlier on December when he was addressing to these issues, characterizing the Jewish intellectuals as the Jewish consciousness. For people who are not religious, the Jewish consciousness gives them an identity. Now, regarding what a couple of statements I disagree with Ms. Newhouse. You mentioned that the definition of secularism of being non-religious Jews is a nonsense. I don't agree on that. And second, you also said that the non-affiliated Jews is also a non-existing entity. I don't agree. There are non-affiliated Jews. We have to admit there are. Just like there are also, and I haven't heard from the entire panel, atheist Jews. I am the third generation born non-religious. I have a very strong Jewish identity. I'm involved in so many organizations and I don't have a personal relationship with God. And there's nothing wrong on that.
Okay,
so
great.
If you can address these issues.
Alana, please.
I don't know what to say. What I was asserting before was that there is this idea that a huge swath of American Jews are unaffiliated. And what I mean to say is that that is not an identity that people understand as something that they wear. They don't see themselves as unaffiliated, and that rubric is not helpful because it actually does not describe properly how those people live their lives. You can disagree with me, and maybe you're right and maybe I'm right, but judging from the readership of Tablet, the people who Jewish communal professionals identify as the block of people who are unaffiliated are not unaffiliated.
Great. Let's take a quick question. Yes, please. Okay. A very little statement.
It's the S word. It's the S word.
Since you said so, a little statement. Where I lived before the war, YIVO was in Vilna. And I'm very proud of you that you organized the YIVO in New York. Very proud of you. Because this continues the Yiddish language that I was taught way back. Now, my name is Essie Shore, and I finished Lehman College, and I also have a bachelor degree in social work. I acquired my education in the latter part of my life. I also wrote a book, Essie, the true story of the Belsky partisans. Belsky partisans. And Mr. Jonathan Brent has my book. I'm not selling my book here. Yes, but it's only 80 pages, and it's for young adults.
Aunt Essie, what's the question, Aunt Essie? Tell us. We want to hear.
I have no question. I'm very proud of you. I'm very proud of you, as I emphasized. Oh, for you, something that'll make you feel good.
Tell me.
My grandson is marrying a Sephardic girl. And we're very proud of him and her, a lovely young lady.
Thank you, Essie. Let's take this woman and this man, and we're done. Yes. Right.
I'm interested in the
Quiet, please. Quiet. Thank you, Essie.
proliferation of.
You were great.
I'm interested in the proliferation of comments and discussion about the Abrahamic religions, so that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are more and more being bunched together as a way, I think, of stressing the things that we all have in common as opposed to the things that are different. And I'm taking the very long view and want to know if what your concern is long term. I mean, on the one hand, I'm attached to Jewish culture and want to see it succeed and continue. On the other hand, I see it's not just Jews who lose by this intermarriage. I had a young student who was half Catholic, whose grandmother died, and I said, well, how did the funeral go? He said, well, there was a man on a stick, and I didn't know what that was. So I'm wondering, okay, so get on with it.
Right.
The whole notion of our people being as many as the stars in the sky and the dust of the earth, perhaps Judaism as a culture is this Abrahamic, these Abrahamic religions that our role is to spread out, just as we are doing.
Sam, please.
I think you have to put this in historical perspective. There are certainly plenty of theological bases for commonality between Islam, particularly in Judaism, even more in some ways than Christianity and Judaism. But to use the highfalutin academic language, what you're describing, the current concern about and talk about the Abrahamic faith, is also a social construction. And by the way, it's a useful one. Deborah Dashmore, I don't know if she's still in the house here, who's on the previous panel, wrote a brilliant book called GI Jews, which was about American Jews fighting in World War II. And she pointed out that the quote-unquote Judeo-Christian tradition was invented during World War II. It was invented as a way of creating a unified fighting force because Jews and Christians who had never encountered each other, unless it was the Irish kid chasing the Jew home and beating him up for being a Christ killer, had to be a unified fighting force, and they're fighting against the godless Nazis. That tradition dates back to December 8th, 1941, and it served a great purpose, and it was a powerful binding force in American society after the war. And I feel that the emphasis on the Abrahamic religions now is a similar and similarly important and useful and efficacious social construction at a time when Islamophobia is rampant in this country and when American Jews and American Muslims are going to have to find a way to coexist productively in this country, even while they'll disagree every day of their lives on the Israel and Palestine issue. And that look for common ground is part of how we'll keep from having an internal civil war, just as the quote-unquote Judeo-Christian tradition was for its own time 70 or 80 years ago.
Okay, let the record show that I wanted to end the session, but Alana New House wanted this gentleman to be the last question of the day.
I have a question, not a comment.
Okay.
Good.
Great.
See?
Would the panel agree that we live in a very unusual time? The reason being that we live in a secular society in the general scheme of things. We live in a secular society in the growing Jewish adaptation to universalism. What we do now is we have a situation, if you agree, that means that the secularism is helping create religious aspects by this means, by popularizing the identity into Judaism. The identity into Judaism coming from Tikkun Olam and Tzedakah, which are two concepts that define the way Jews go into Judaism. This is the same definition that helps the religious institutions of the country. So, isn't it ironic that the ironic end here is that the Jewish institutions depend on the secular society to make their cause.
And the question is, in a sentence?
The question is, do you agree with that approach?
Isn't it ironic? JJ, everyone speaks. Here we go.
No, just JJ.
Just JJ.
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't it ironic that the Jewish institute? I think there are Tikkun Olam is actually, as Orthodox Jews like to point out, the full phrase is Tikkun Olam b'malchut Shaddai, repairing the world under the kingship of God. In other words, bringing all the world to recognize the one God. That was the Tikkun Olam we did for the first 2,000 years of this era. We spread to half of the world the notion of a single God. It hasn't worked out that well for us. But I think it transmitted an important and significant message. Today, what distinguishes Jews, especially American Jews, is the shorter version of Tikkun Olam. If you look at the fact that a quarter of the Democrats in the Senate are Jewish. If you look at the population, even the leadership of the AFL-CIO, the people who are organizing hotel workers, the Jews are in the forefront of the social justice, and I don't like the term, progressive, liberal, social democratic activism. And Joseph Stiglitz, look at the books that are talking about that's, if anything, our mission today. I think Bob Dylan contributed to it enormously. I think there's a whole culture built around this Tikkun Olam. It's challenging in the same way that we challenged the Romans to adopt one God. We're now challenging the Christians and the Muslims to adopt a socially responsible, mutual responsibility ethic. So I think that there's no irony in it. We grow as a people in the parts of our body of belief that become important to a given era. Once it was one God. Today it is people responsible for each other. And I think we're blessed. I thank God that we don't worry about God that much.
And I thank God, too. We are blessed with lunch. I want to thank all of our panelists, ladies and gentlemen.